Greetings, global gardeners. It's Monday. Let's talk some gardening. We've had a good full week. Many of us have had record-breaking temperature, and it's going to continue. My garden is waking up. There's green growing. I've been outside as often as possible, and I will continue to get outside and do more. Had a relatively exciting week last week. I had the opportunity to speak to a couple different groups. One was a local civic group. I was talking about gardening, of course. I had a focus on raised bed gardening. No surprise, since I have my book on raised bed gardening. And I encountered something that happens periodically. And when it happens, of course, it's a light bulb moment. It's a slap in the face. It's one of those realizations that I don't know why it's not forefront on my mind most often when I'm talking to groups like this. But we were probably 15 minutes into the presentation, and I was talking about raised beds, and a woman raised her hand, and I said, yes. And she said, "What's a raised bed?" Well, most of you are probably well aware of what a raised bed is, but there are gardeners of all different levels that really don't fully understand raised beds. And as I thought more about it after answering her question, of course, based on the other questions that came up in that group, I realized that when we gardeners talk to each other, we have our own language. We have our own words and definitions, and we can converse pretty well, for the most part, at different levels. But those of us that have been doing this for so long and then are used to talking every Monday about gardening, we can lose sight of the fact that most people aren't gardeners. And those that are just beginning to get into gardening don't know that secret language, all of those terms that we throw back and forth. And even some more experienced gardeners may not fully understand what we're talking about when we come from a different region or we practice a different type of gardening. I saw this last year in the UK, going through Scotland and Wales and England, and was able to talk to all of the gardeners. But when I was kind of the guy on the outside and they were talking between each other about their plants and their methods and what they were doing, I didn't always understand exactly what they were talking about because the terminology was different in many cases. We'd be talking about the same thing, the same method, the same appreciation of the plant or the process, but the language itself was sometimes literally lost in the translation. So today, I want to get back to the basics. I want to start talking about some of the basic terminology, about some of the basic definitions of gardening. And for you out there in this conversation, let me know what words, what aspects of gardening that maybe you don't fully understand or that maybe you'd like to know a little bit more about, particularly when we talk about the basics. So that's the focus of the show today. I look forward to all of your comments, of course, all the interplay going back and forth. Shout out, of course, to Jay and Shawnee and all the help that you are giving the entire community today. And let's have a nice conversation about the basics of gardening. And so raised beds are a great way to start because that's what has generated the idea for me today. And I can understand why raised bed gardening can be a little confusing, particularly for gardeners who have never really done raised bed gardening. In my book, I talk about dozens of different types of raised beds. My son has some beds, and I visited him this weekend. It was a wonderful trip, by the way. Transportation, a nightmare, but the trip itself was wonderful. And he is growing in raised beds. He's growing in a type of raised bed that I call an elevated bed. And this is one of those terms that I don't see applied at all by any other gardeners, but that's the terminology I use because I think it's more appropriate. And so if you're not familiar with the raised bed concept versus the elevated bed concept, there are differences, but there's a lot of similarity. So for me, a raised bed is basically any bed that is elevated above the level of the natural soil surface for the purpose of growing plants in it to get the benefits of a raised area. Now, it's typically, when we think about the gardens that we have and what we see on YouTube, it's typically a box, a 4-foot wide by 8-foot long wooden box. And that's what we're growing our vegetables in. And that's what most people tend to think of as a raised bed. But it doesn't need sides. It can be a mound. And as long as that mound has the amended soil and we're growing plants in it and it rises above the soil level, it's a raised bed. Now, if we want a higher raised bed, one that is so high that we don't even have to bend over. So now it's a bed, typically wood, often metal, with legs on it so that the space underneath the actual growing area is open to the air. It's just like a big table with a bed on it. That's what I call an elevated bed. You may have different terminology and you may look at it or not even think about it from a completely different perspective. But those are some of the nuances, the differences when we talk about simple raised bed gardening. And we can have a bed that's just a mound of soil 6 inches high. We can have a wooden box that's 16 inches high. And we can have another wooden box elevated on legs that's 36 inches high. And all of those fall into the basic category of raised beds. So if you hadn't thought about it before, now you can see, yeah, that can be confusing, especially for someone who doesn't understand what it is to start with. And now we're throwing out all of these different methods, but still calling them the same type of thing. Andre is saying, "Hi, Scott. I'm from Serbia. And although English is my second language, I've been following you for a few years now and understand all the terminology you use." Well, thank you for that, Andre. I appreciate it. And coincidentally, I'm going to Croatia this summer. So send me an email, if you would, to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. And I'd be interested to do the same or you do the same for me as I encounter some of the words from Croatia and Serbia and that area that might be helpful for me on my travels. So thank you for being here. And thank you for saying that, because particularly that part of Europe, as I'm getting ready to do my trip, I'm finding a lot of differences in just the common terminology that we use on a daily basis. And you can see how in gardening, it can become even more complex. Michelle is asking a question about soil blocking. What comes next after they outgrow these blocks, move to pots? And so here's another one. What is soil blocking? And if you've never done blocks when you start your seeds, this could be a completely foreign concept. And so the idea, Jay may already be ahead of me on this, but I got an older video on soil blocks. The idea is that you take usually a soilless mix. So you take potting mix. I typically will add extra peat moss or coco coir to hold it all together. And that's what you start your seeds in. And you can buy the blockers that are these devices, these metal clamp looking things that you squeeze and they create these blocks. And the blocks have a little dimple in the top, and that's where you put your seed. And then in that block, no pot, no sides, just a block of potting mix, you start your seeds. And then at some point, the roots begin to grow outside the block. Now that can be beneficial because if you're trying to limit the size of the plant, once those roots hit the air, they're going to stop growing. And so the block holds those roots within the block, and the plant size pretty much matches the size of the block. But if you're growing the plants with the purpose of putting them out in your garden or someplace like potted containers, then you want to think about continuing the growth of that plant. The thing about the soil blocks is that they come in different sizes. And so depending on the size of the block you're using now, you can probably find another block and it's designed to transplant into. So I've got some soil blockers that make the block, and they'll make a block that's like about 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch in a cube. And you can start little seeds in that. And then I've got a bigger blocker that is 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches. And it's designed to put that 1 inch block inside of it. And then I've got another blocker that's 4 inches by 4 inches by 4 inches. And it's designed to put the 2 inch block inside of it. So just like most of us, and this is the primary way I garden, where I start in a container and then move to a bigger pot and then move to a bigger pot, you can do the same thing with the blocks themselves with no pot at all. If you don't have that bigger size blocker and you're ready to give it the extra growth, then yes, you would put it either into a pot, or if it's big enough of a plant, you could transplant it out into your garden or into whatever container you're going to be growing in. So the key is whether you want to continue blocking using the soil blocks and go into a bigger size or put it in a pot. And I find it easier to start those smaller blocks and then to put them into a pot, because when I'm hardening off, when I'm doing transplanting, personally, I find it easier to do with pots than with blocks at that point when they get to be a little bit bigger plant. But that's a good example of terminology that even experienced gardeners may not understand what a soil block is or what blocking is when you're starting your seeds if you haven't done it before. And that can actually, again, lead to some misunderstandings about what we're doing in our garden when we don't fully understand what it is we're talking about. The soil blocking in particular, I've seen some videos and talked with some gardeners when they talk about blocks in their garden, they're actually talking more like square foot gardening, where when we talk square foot gardening, we take a bed, again, typically a 4 foot by 8 foot bed, and we divide it into a grid, and each one of the pieces of the grid are 1 square foot space. So in a 4 foot by 8 foot bed, we have 32 square feet, and we would break it into a grid of 32 1 foot by 1 foot blocks. And that's where I've heard the term block used quite often. And it's completely different than soil blocking when we're starting seeds. So that's an important differentiation that you need to understand when someone's talking about something. Now that you know two different things that use the same term, it can make a big difference. Boothby Gardens is saying, are there major differences in how the type of nitrogen sources impact growth, e.g. blood meal versus urea, etc.? Yeah, there can be. So when we talk about nitrogen, we've got nitrites, we've got nitrates, we have ammonium. There are different types of nitrogen when we're looking at the elemental nitrogen that the plants are using in different ways. And some of those, like particularly the nitrites and the nitrates, they need to be broken from one into the other before they can be used. Ammonium is what's often used in fertilizers. So when we talk about urea, as I understand it, is ammonium. And so it's more readily available to plants, whereas blood meal has to be broken down. Blood meal is one of those organic fertilizers, a nitrogen fertilizer. But when we add it to the soil, it is the soil microbes that now break it down and release those specific nitrogen components. So yeah, there are some major differences. If you use your water soluble blue powder that you mix with water and pour it on the soil, those are the type of nutrients, nitrogen in particular, that are immediately available to plants in the usable form. If you use something like urea, it still needs to be broken down, but it's closer to the usable form that the plants are ready to use. And when you use something like blood meal, it takes even longer for it to break down and for those nutrients to be made available to the plants. And so do recognize, as we're talking about some of the basics today, not all fertilizers are the same. Even if it says, nitrogen used for your flowers, your grasses, your leafy greens, whatever you might be using a nitrogen fertilizer for, it takes a different amount of time for those particular fertilizers to be usable for the plants. The slow release fertilizers that you might see, like if you're getting a potting mix and it says it has a slow release fertilizer in it, and you see those little pellets, typically they're little yellow pellets, they might be little white pellets. Those are little beads of fertilizer. They need water, they need soil microbes to be able to make it all available to the plants. So the basics of fertilizer are relatively easy. Everybody should know about NPK, that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are macronutrients. Those are nutrients that all plants need, but there are other nutrients that are also very important, talking about sulfur and calcium and magnesium, also macronutrients that plants need. And then you've got micronutrients. You have a whole bunch of the nutrients that fall into just trace amounts are needed for the plants. And so those might be copper, for instance, is a micronutrient that plants are going to need. And manganese are a nutrient. And iron, there are so many of these micronutrients that probably are not going to be in the fertilizer mix that you get. And so when we talk about soil tests, again, a basic idea of gardening, before you are using fertilizers in your garden, you really should have a soil test to see what nutrients are already naturally occurring in your soil. Calcium is one of those that it's pretty much in all of our soils, but yet there's a big push to add calcium as a fertilizer because of things like blossom end rot in tomatoes. Blossom end rot is caused by a calcium deficiency. And so you'll have marketers that say, add this to make your tomatoes grow better. Well, because there's already enough calcium in almost all of our soils, you really don't need to add more. You don't need to be wasting your money on buying a fertilizer that your soil is already plenty for what the plants are going to need. Blossom end rot happens to be more often a cause of inconsistent watering. When we get down to the basics of like calcium, there are different types of calcium that are in our soil, different types of calcium that the plants can use versus what they can't use. The type of calcium that's in eggshells is not the same kind of calcium that the plants can use as part of their growth cycle. So all of those tips to bury eggshells to add calcium for your tomatoes, again, at the basic level, it's not the same. It's a different elemental form of calcium that really doesn't benefit our plants. So there can be some minor and major differences when we talk about just the basic components, the basic nutrients that plants need. And that's where you dig a little bit deeper, and the experience and channels like mine and many others will help educate the gardeners to understand the differences of those type of things. So just be aware as we talk about some of these definitions, that it really can make a big difference as to what success you're having in your garden. And all of us, as we do our gardening journey, have to learn the differences in the words we're using and how those basic ideas of elemental sulfur, for instance. So I use sulfur in my blueberry pots, not because I'm deficient in sulfur, but because sulfur can change the pH of the soil. And so that now becomes another component that we all need to be aware of, the pH of the soil. Most of the plants that we have should have a pH in the roughly neutral zone. So it's about 6.0 to 6.5 tends to be ideal for most of the plants we're going to grow in our garden. But some plants need a higher pH, closer to 7, and some plants need a lower pH, closer to 5. And so blueberries are one of those that need a low pH, near 5.0 or 4.5 even. You don't have to understand chemistry or physics and how the hydrogen molecules are interacting with the soil to determine what the pH is or what the cation exchange is. You don't need to know that stuff. You just need to understand that your soil should be tested so that you know what the pH is and if it is suitable for what your plants need, and if not, what you can do to modify it. And that's one of those things, and it's very regional. So for instance, when we talk about the pH of a soil, generally, the amount of water that is flowing through that soil will affect the pH. And so the areas in the United States, for example, the South, the Eastern seaboard that get a lot of rain, and so that rain is leaching out some of those elements from the soil, and it's affecting the pH. It's making it more acidic. So in many areas of the eastern United States, the soil is acidic. But now you move inland to where I am, near the Rocky Mountains, where we don't get a lot of rain. It's very dry, and we don't have that same leaching of the elements in the soil. So our soil is generally not acidic. It's the complete opposite. It's alkaline. Understanding that the alkaline versus acidic soil makes a difference in your garden can influence what you do with your gardening. And some of the simple techniques that have been used for hundreds of years may not work. And the example I like to talk about is wood ash. In those rainy areas where the soil is acidic, they'll add potash, the wood ash from the fireplace, to raise the pH and also add potassium to the soil. Wood ash is alkaline. It raises the pH. In an area like mine where the soil is already alkaline, if I see a video about adding wood ash to my garden to add potassium, I could be completely changing the pH of my soil, and I could have a ton of potassium that is not available to the plants because the plants can't access it unless they're growing within that neutral range of pH. So basic ideas like that of whether we should be using a method that our grandfathers used can make a difference. If you're gardening in Colorado, like I am, and you're trying to garden the same way that your grandfather gardened in Tennessee, it's probably not going to work out very well. And that's why it's important to get back to the basics and understand what your garden needs and how to modify your gardening for your own benefit and not to match somebody else's. I talk about that a lot. Don't copy my methods just because I am successful with doing it. Learn why the methods work and then modify them if needed in your garden, or use them if they work in your garden. So, all those great gardeners in San Diego and Tennessee and South Carolina, Florida, New Jersey, yeah, they've got great gardens. They've got great YouTube channels. They're doing wonderful things, but it doesn't match those of us that might be living in Wyoming or South Dakota or Iowa or Ohio or Colorado or Arizona or New Mexico. There are a lot of differences, and we all need to learn to recognize that. Greg says, my wife likes to laugh at me when I throw out gardening jargon as if everyone knows what I'm talking about. I feel briefly more knowledgeable. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. It is the kind of thing that we just throw it out because that's the way we talk, but not everybody understands it. And I think it can be important to recognize that. Pat says, I moved from the Texas Gulf Coast to southern Colorado, gumbo soil to sandy shale. I struggled for 5 years until I discovered raised beds. I almost gave up on gardening altogether. And so, that's a big reason why I wrote a book on raised beds and why I talk about raised beds all the time, because Pat just lives down the road from me. It's that in Colorado, our soil is terrible. If you do a soil test, it's very low in organic matter, virtually no nitrogen in the soil whatsoever. It's low in a number of other nutrients as well. It's compacted. It might be nothing but clay. It might be nothing but sand. It is crazy bad soil. And like Pat said, struggled for 5 years. And that's what most gardeners do in this area, which is why I have so many people that I've talked to that started gardening and gave up after a couple years, because it's hard in an area like this. But when you learn the basics of raised beds, you learn that raised beds can be filled with a soil that matches exactly what you're looking for: the pH, the nutrient levels, the organic matter in the soil. Those all are very important, and raised beds make a difference. So when we talk about organic matter, this is another one of those terms that can often be confusing, because we go to the store and we'll buy organic peppers, or we'll buy a box of cereal that's made with organic ingredients. There are so many things around us that have this little organic tag on it. And then somebody like me says, use organic matter in your soil. And so for many, it now becomes, oh, so I need to find a box or a bag that's labeled organic soil and add that to my garden. Or I need to find something that is organic compost and add it to my soil. And that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about organic matter in the soil, or when I talk about using organic materials, or when I talk about the soil organisms breaking down the organics in the soil into nutrients that are available for the plants to use. There are basically two different definitions of organic. So all that stuff in the store, for the most part, is certified organic. And when we talk about the food or the produce that is certified organic, it is coming from a grower or a manufacturer that is using very specific methods that have to be certified by the USDA to be able to get that little sticker that they put on their boxes. When I talk about organic gardening or putting organic material in the soil, I'm not talking about anything that's been certified, anything that has followed any regulation from the USDA. Instead, I'm talking about the material that at one point was alive and now it's not, and I'm using it in my garden. So when the leaves are growing on your tree and then fall, those leaves are organic material. They were live leaves and now they're dead leaves, and I can put them on the soil. I could put live leaves. I could just trim off the leaves from a tree and put them on my soil. Both of those are organic ingredients. When we cut our grass, cut our lawns, those grass clippings are organic material. They can be either green material while they're still fresh, or as they brown, they become the dry brown ingredients that we might be putting in our soil, in our compost. So for gardeners, for the most part, when we talk organic materials, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the wood chips that we might use as a mulch, or the straw that we use as a mulch. We're talking about those leaves and those grasses. We're talking about banana peels and scraps from our kitchen that might find their way into our garden. Those are all organic ingredients to whatever we're going to be using. So if we add them to our compost pile, it's an organic ingredient in our compost pile. The bacteria in the compost break those bigger pieces down and release those nutrients. And then you take the compost after it's been cooking, after it's been decomposing for weeks. And now you might add that to your soil. Well, what you're adding to your soil is organic matter in the form of compost. If you're doing trench composting, I was just talking to a gardener this last week about trench composting. The idea is instead of putting a big heap of things in a big pile and having a compost pile so that it breaks down into smaller organic pieces and adding that organic matter to your soil, instead we dig a trench in our beds and we bury organic material in the trench. And then the microbes and the earthworms and the fungi break down that buried material that's in our bed and release the nutrients into the soil around it. So it can be chunky, it can be fine particles, but if it's something that came from a plant of some type or an animal of some type, it is something that we would add to our soil or put on top of our soil as organic matter. Now, there's a difference between what's in our soil and what's on top of our soil. When we add organic matter to our soil, when we incorporate it in with the soil, it now becomes a soil amendment. We're amending the soil with that organic matter. If we just spread it on top of the soil, now it's a mulch. Mulch is what we put on top of the soil. And this is some terminology that often confuses people as well, that it can be the same material, but we call it different things based on how we use it. I use compost a lot in my soil as a soil amendment. I also use compost, particularly the chunkier compost that isn't fully decomposed. I use that type of compost as a mulch on top of the soil. And so when we throw out a term like organic matter and soil, you now have to ask that question. Are you using it as a soil amendment, or are you using it as a mulch? And gardeners can understand the difference, particularly once you learn it. For everybody else, it makes absolutely no sense why we might be talking about the same thing in different ways. And so be aware of that. That's why I think it's important that I and everyone occasionally slow down and try to get back to the basics and think about the fact that when we start talking to other gardeners, we lose sight that we might be alienating some of those newer gardeners that are standing around us and listening, and they're not understanding what we're talking about. And that can actually be disheartening. I've seen it in my garden club. You have new people show up and they want to participate and they want to learn about gardening. And then we're giving a presentation about gardening. And at the end, I'll ask, what do you think? And too often they're like, I didn't understand what you were talking about. Not necessarily me, but the club in general, because we've got experienced gardeners and we've got new gardeners. The experienced gardeners, we all talk with each other using that jargon, and the new gardeners don't understand. So help the new gardeners around you as they are trying to learn some of these these terms with the gardening. Shandy's Garden is asking questions. Swales are elevated beds. I got such a soggy problem here. I'm thinking about using them to slow and retain water before it reaches my home. Which plants like really wet feet? And so again, slight difference in the terminology. So a swale is elevated soil. It's like a mounded line of soil that is used to direct water. It's used in permaculture to capture water. If you have a hill, you can put a swale, and it's kind of like a dam, so that as the water rolls down the hill, it comes to this elevated line of soil, and then it seeps into the hill, and it makes a big difference with erosion. It can make a big difference in how you direct the flow of water in your garden area. And swales can really be great. They differ in that a raised bed, as I talked about earlier, is simply a mound that you would plant in. Now, you can use a swale as a raised bed, because a raised bed is a mound of soil in this case, and a swale is a mound of soil in this case. And so the key is you've got to look in your particular area about what kind of plants like really wet feet. And so, I see trees like cottonwoods and willow trees in my area that are always growing by the creeks and the rivers because they like the wet soil. There are, ivies in particular that tend to like wet. Depending on whether you've got sun or shade, ferns are often, planted in a really wet area. So I would check locally just to see what plants would do best in your area, whether they're sunny plants or whether they're shade-loving plants. But we get back to the pH concerns and matching plants to a particular area. So I'm hesitant to recommend any particular plants, not knowing what might do best in your area. So give it to master gardeners and see what they recommend for wet in your area. We don't really grow a lot of wet feet plants here in my part of Colorado because it's just so dry. We have the opposite issue where we're having to find plants that don't need water, that can work in a garden in a xeric manner. So when we talk xeric and xeriscape, it's a type of gardening or a type of plant that requires low water. Water-wise gardening is what we now call xeriscaping. So 10 years ago, 20 years ago, xeriscaping was a term that many of us that live in dry regions were learning about. Native plants, landscaping so we don't use water, taking out the turf grass, and that was called xeriscaping, still called xeriscaping. But the preferred term that I see now is water-wise gardening. And some of that is marketing, just so people understand the difference, because when we talk definitions, xeriscaping, Xeri, xeriscaping, was being confused as xeroscaping, Zero. And people were putting in their landscapes xeriscaping, thinking they were xeroscaping, and therefore they needed no water at all. And so people converted their landscapes and killed all their plants because they never gave them any water. That's one of those terminologies now, getting back to the basic definitions of why water-wise is the preferred term, because those plants, even if they're native plants, even if they don't require much water at all, they're still going to require some water. And so it's watering wisely to make sure you keep your plants alive and don't kill everything just because you're thinking that you're getting off with zero water usage, and you can still have a beautiful landscape. You can have a beautiful landscape, but it requires a little bit of water, wise use of water. So be aware of that it does make a difference. Okay, it's so nice to see everybody here. I want to make sure that I try to cover as many of these as possible. TJ the Hawk says, my brassica seedlings have really struggled for some reason this year. All of my other seedlings are fine, but the broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower keep wilting after the first leaves. Thoughts? It could be the water if you're growing them in little containers, or if you're growing them in pots or even outside. That's the biggest issue I often see with the young seedlings with wilting, is they're either not getting enough water or too little water. I've had that issue this year because I'm testing some different potting mixes using different organic ingredients, and the compost that I'm using is terrible and it's chunky, and I think the pH is way off, and it's causing my seedlings to struggle. And so that could be it. Your potting mix may be creating some of the problem. And I think one of the issues that I'm having with some of the seedlings I'm starting to grow is that I'm using a potting mix that has some of that slow release fertilizer in it. And young seedlings don't need fertilizer for the most part. If they get too much fertilizer, that can affect how they grow, to include those first few leaves struggling and maybe wilting. So it's not all plants, and that's why it can be confusing. It's interesting that it's just your brassicas, but take a look at if you're using a different type of mix, or if you're watering differently than with the other plants, and that can be a consideration. If you're reusing a mix that may have been outside, and usually it comes in from outside, it could be a fungal problem. And because there are different fungi that live out in our garden and they find their way in the house because of how we use our potting mixes, and sometimes those can stunt young plants too. So those are some ideas that might make a difference. And so take a look in that. Just try to figure out what the difference is between the different plants that you're using. The heat in the room, I've noticed, like, even though for the most part our days have been very warm, until very recently our nights were pretty cool, and my basement was actually cooler than it has been in recent years. Now that shouldn't affect brassicas, but I noticed it with my warmer season plants and some of my flowers, that the cooler basement where I have my seedlings was impacting. So if it's too warm or too cool, that can affect how the seedlings grow. So to look at a lot of those different factors and see if something is different when you are trying to compare it to some other plant that might be doing well. And that's a big part of gardening, is recognizing why something is different and what it is that is different, and then analyzing it and trying to figure it out. Masabi Gal saying, what plants are just not good to transplant into the garden? They don't do well being transplanted. Generally, most root vegetables don't transplant well. So when you have a plant like carrots are the best example. They have a single root that's growing down to create the carrot. It's a tap root. And so a tap root, the basic definition is that it's a single deep vertical root that's going into the soil. And so if you start carrots in a pot and then transplant it, if you damage that taproot at all, then the plant's not going to do well. I have transplanted beets with mixed success. I've transplanted turnips with mixed success. And so generally the root vegetables don't transplant well. Most everything else, you do need to recognize that some plants don't like their roots disturbed, and it might influence how well they recover or don't recover from that. And so every plant is different, and you just have to look at the individual plants as to whether they are best transplanted or not. Some of those that really don't like their roots disturbed are squashes. There are a lot of squashes that it can be transplanted, but they might suffer. They might have extra shock. It may take them longer to recover. And so on the seed packet, when you look at pumpkins and squashes, it may say start 3 to 4 weeks before your last frost date. And yeah, by all means, consider doing that. Just be aware that when you transplant those into the garden, you really need to be careful about disrupting the roots at transplanting time. And the best seed packets will often tell you that. That's a big reason why I like botanical interests, is because they'll often give you that extra information that says, don't disturb the roots, or sensitive to transplanting in the garden. The peppers, the tomatoes, all of those type of plants that many of us are growing inside and transplanting outside is just the complete opposite. They are so durable. They can take great abuse with their roots and still do fine. It's some of those others, and that's why you're asking the question, I'm sure, that you transplant and you find that they just don't do as well. Peas kind of fall into that category. Depending on the pea you're growing, peas don't transplant well. But I see a lot of gardening shows from the UK, and they're transplanting peas. It's a big difference in how you transplant, and recognizing that if you can disrupt the roots the least amount possible, then you can almost transplant anything. But I would still avoid transplanting carrots and some of the other root vegetables, just because it can be so difficult to be able to get the plant growing the way you want it to be growing. So keep that in mind. Sabi Gal says, I was shocked at the cost and size of the snapdragon seeds I purchased. Will snapdragons self-seed in zone 3, 4? I'm not sure about zone 3. I know that my snapdragons here in 5 self-seed without too much problem. And they should be fine for 4. I don't know about zone 3. So it might depend on the variety of snapdragon that you're growing. But yeah, for me in zone 5, they do quite well without any difficulty. I love snapdragons, and I love seeing them pop up in new areas as well. And I'll take the flowers and sprinkle the seeds in new areas to try to get them to grow, because I think it's just a happy plant. And it's so fun if you've got kids, that you can pluck the flower and move the mouth so it actually looks like a snapdragon. That's a lot of fun. And I like to take advantage of that, particularly when I've got kids around, that I can demonstrate a snapdragon with the flowers on those plants. So it makes a big difference. Michelle says, can I just put my household compost directly into my raised beds and turn in? Thank you so much. So possibly. So when you talk about household compost, if you have one of those little machines that is grinding and breaking your organic matter into smaller particles, and I have one, I'll be making a video about that here in another month or so. That's not technically compost. It is the kitchen scraps that have been broken down into smaller pieces. And yes, you can put that into your garden bed as organic matter. Just recognize that compost has been decomposed by microbes, and therefore it's no longer the raw ingredients. So when you compost banana peels and coffee grounds and old slices of bread and the scrapings of your potatoes, put it in your compost, those are raw ingredients, and then they're broken down and they become compost. So compost is decomposed organic matter, and it's decomposed at different rates, which is why some of it is big and some of it's small, and you might still see pieces of those bigger organic ingredients that you put into your compost. When we use one of these machines in our kitchen, that are grinding and breaking down and cooking the ingredients to arrive at a powder or a granular result, it's still raw ingredients. It hasn't been decomposed yet. The microbes have not taken that organic matter and decomposed it into the nutrient that the plant is going to need. So if you add that to your soil, and by all means, that's a great idea. Those machines are wonderful for doing that. Just recognize that it's going to take a little while for the microbes in your soil to now complete that decomposition for the plants. So with compost, if we're going to amend a garden bed, I recommend at least 4 to 6 weeks. Put the compost in before you're going to plant, because it's mostly decomposed, but the soil microbes still need to distribute it. They still need to break it down a little bit more. They still need to make those nutrients like the nitrites and the nitrates available to the plants, and that takes some time. When we put raw ingredients in, if you're doing the trench composting, like I mentioned earlier, and you're putting chunky bananas and chunky potato peels and all the rest of your kitchen scraps, it might take 2 or 3 months before that is broken down enough for the plants to begin using it. When you're using the powdered compost from your kitchen, then that's the kind of thing that it's a little bit quicker because they're smaller particles, but you should probably still wait 6 to 8 months before putting plants in, because it's going to take a while for those to be available. So depending on how you're defining household compost, that will make a difference as to whether it is still in the kitchen in that granular form, or whether you put it into your compost pile and now it's mostly decomposed. Go ahead and turn it into your soil beds, and then just give it enough time for the soil microbes to make it available for the plants. And anytime I am in my beds, I like to give it at least a month before I put the plants in, because the nutrients, particularly the nitrogen, can reach an imbalance if you put the plants in too quickly. And I think I talked about that a couple weeks ago. So organic matter is good for the soil, almost any form. It's the time factor that we need to be aware of when we're talking about how we're going to use the compost and when we're going to put the plants in particular. Okay, let's see. Red Hand Spun Hand Woven is saying, for those of us in the wild west of Colorado, any advice for actions we can take now for our veggie gardens to prep for the upcoming drought summer? And this is tied in directly with what I was just talking about, organic matter. One of the benefits when we put organic matter into our soil is that as it decomposes, as it's being broken down into those smaller particles, it acts like little sponges. All of those dried bits of compost, when they are worked into your soil as a soil amendment, they absorb water and they hold on to water. And so the more organic matter you can incorporate into your soil, the better the water retention is of your soil. And raised beds, while I love them in so many ways, one of the issues with raised beds, one of the cons, is that they dry out faster than an in-ground bed. Especially for raised beds, you need to make sure you have a lot of good organic matter incorporated into your soil as an amendment. And because that's a reason many of us are using raised beds in the first place, generally the soil is going to be a little bit richer, but that's one of the best things that I would recommend. I would also recommend, if you're going into the summer, and this holds true for everybody, but especially for those of us in drought regions, put hoops over your bed and use shade cloth. The sun that bakes us at our high altitude here in Colorado dries out the soil very quickly, which means you've got to cut down on the sun, add a little bit of shade to your garden beds, and you can do that with shade cloth. So I use hoops and shade cloth throughout the summer, which makes a difference. And then, of course, you've got to have mulch. And so I talked earlier about the differences with amendments and mulch. Mulch has a number of benefits. One of those benefits is that it reduces soil evaporation. So when you put an organic mulch on the top of your soil, the water that's in the soil, as it begins to evaporates less if you've got a mulch on top. If you've got bare soil, it's going to evaporate very quickly. And that top inch and then 2 inches and then 3 inches is going to dry out. If you put a mulch on top of the soil, it's still going to evaporate, but at a much slower rate and at a rate that may not even be noticeable because you're watering on a regular basis. So those are the big things that I practice living in a drought environment: organic matter, mulch, and shade cloth in particular. And water as needed to keep the soil moist, because particularly if you're using organic matter like peat moss or cocoa coir that might be mixed into the soil, they are hydrophobic. So there's a good term to know. Hydrophobic means that it is basically afraid of water. And so if you've got peat moss or cocoa coir and it dries out, then when you put water on it again, the water just sheds off. It won't absorb the water very quickly when it's dry. It will absorb the water if it's moist. And that's why it's important, if you're using those ingredients, to keep your soil moist. Don't let it dry out, because it takes a lot more water for those organic particles to get moist than it takes to keep them moist. And recognize that difference. And you might have to water. There are days that I have to water twice a day when we've got the hot temperatures and the low humidity and the incredibly high winds. Soil can dry out in just a matter of seconds, it seems. Those are the kind of days that I might water twice a day, because even with mulch, even with shade cloth, they're going to evaporate a lot of that soil moisture. Be aware of that and be ready to water more if you have to. And so Michelle is asking, is there a kit to test soil like the baking soda or vinegar test? So yeah, there are a lot of soil kits that you can buy for testing purposes. The best way to test the soil, of course, is to get a professional laboratory analysis, like through your extension office. But for basics, yeah, if you're just trying to figure out what the pH is of your soil. So when I was talking earlier about acid and alkaline, so you can use baking soda, which is an alkaline. And if you add it to your soil and your soil bubbles, then your soil is acidic. The acidity in your soil is interacting with the alkaline of the baking soda and causing it to bubble. If you have absolutely no reaction at all, then that's telling you that your soil is either neutral or alkaline, because it's not reacting to the baking soda. And that's a big, that's an easy way, but it's general. It just gives you a basic idea of whether your soil is acidic or alkaline. And yeah, there are a lot of different tests that you can get. And, of course, you can get them on Amazon. You can get them at your nurseries. But the best way to test your soil, and just do it once. I don't test my soil every year. I tested my soil when I moved in and started this new garden to get that baseline. So I knew exactly what my pH was, exactly what my nutrient levels were. And then I waited a couple of years and amended, got things growing, got the soil microbes happy. And then I did another soil test to see how the results had changed. And they had changed. So that's really the best way to do it. Even though some of those home kits give you a basic idea, it's not precise enough to really affect you as you are making decisions about changing or not changing the pH, or changing or not changing the nutrient levels of the soil. Science is important, particularly in that case, to make sure you get it right. Serena's asking, what is a water table? How is it determined? And so water table is in the ground, and it's determined basically on where the natural or native water that is underground in your area, where it rests in relation to the top of the ground. And so if you live in an area that's very wet and that has a lot of underground moisture, you have your soil surface. And if you're going to dig a well, and this is where it becomes more important, is if you're digging a well, how deep do you need to dig your well to get to the water? And here in Colorado, we got a number of aquifers. So an aquifer is basically a big underground lake. It's a big pool of water underground, a reservoir of water that is in the ground, buried usually pretty deep below the surface of the soil. And so if you dig down 5 feet and you hit water, then your water table is 5 feet deep. If you dig down 80 feet and hit water, then your water table is 80 feet. But for the most part, like in my region, if you're digging deep, we're calling it an aquifer that we might be digging into rather than a water table. Water table tends to be used more in regions where it's only a few feet below the surface. And it often coincides with your elevation. And if you're living in a low lying area where your elevation is double digits, then the water table might just be a few feet below you, maybe 20 feet below you. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about the water table or an aquifer. It's just how far down it is below the soil surface for you to access it. And we don't talk much about the water table near me, because if you're digging a well, you're digging a well hundreds of feet in many cases to access the water, which is why drought becomes a big issue. And the aquifers are being drained throughout the southwestern United States because of those kind of issues. So those of you who have a shallow water table, we're a bit envious of you, because you can have a lot more water a lot cheaper than the rest of us when we're trying to figure out what plants we're going to grow and what's going to work or not work in the particular case, because I have to use water from my water company for everything I do. And it can be a little expensive. It's crazy how much water can actually talk. So nice to see a lot of the discussion going on. Masabi Gal's asking, are worm castings considered hot or mild fertilizer? So when we're talking about the fertilizers, and it gets back to that initial discussion about ammonium in particular, ammonium is a type of nitrogen that can burn plants, particularly the plant roots. Basically, it's too much nitrogen right away for the root to develop, and it causes the root to either dry or to shrivel or to move someplace else. And so when we have something like chicken manure, which is very high in ammonium, it's got that smell. If we use that is a hot fertilizer. It's got a lot of the nitrogen that can cause the roots of young plants to actually be killed off. When we talk about something that is more of a mild fertilizer, and so something like rabbit or alpaca manure, that doesn't have the high levels of ammonium, so it's much more on the mild or low heat side of the spectrum, but they still have higher levels of nitrogen. When we talk about worm castings are pretty much, if you were to do a spectrum between worm castings and chicken manure, that would pretty much define the spectrum. The worm castings are about as low as you can get as far as the ammonium content and whether they're going to burn the roots of plants. They have higher nitrogen, but it's not a high nitrogen fertilizer by any stretch. It's actually got pretty low levels of nitrogen, and it's in a form that is going to be broken down further by the soil microbes almost immediately for the plants to use. So worm castings really shouldn't, in my opinion, be considered a fertilizer because they are such low levels of nitrogen. They have lots of other elements in them, particular calcium is wonderful in worm castings. But to use worm castings as a fertilizer, I instead like to look at it as it's organic matter. It's like any other manure that an animal produces. It's just in small particles, already in the soil, already has soil microbes in it because the earthworms have those soil microbes in their guts. And so it's a great soil amendment to release those nutrients, as opposed to a fertilizer that makes the nutrients available typically in greater amounts. And so, yes, worm castings do add a little bit of nitrogen, but not so much that I think you would be using that as a nitrogen fertilizer source. The basics of fertilizer, when we start talking about the basics of gardening, is that fertilizers give plants nutrients, usually more quickly than other options like organic amending. The key difference is that a soil that has the organic matter in it and that has been given the time for those nutrients to be made available to the plants, that soil doesn't need fertilizer. Again, the whole concept of you need a soil test to determine what the nutrients are. The methods of gardening that so many people, too many people, ascribe to is fertilize. Fertilize every other week. Fertilize 3 times a season. Fertilize consistently. I don't. My soil is good enough that it doesn't need, the plants don't need additional nutrients from a synthetic source or even an organic source. It's present in the soil and the plants will do fine without it. And so recognize that if you are trying to practice that type of gardening or you're building good soil, then learn about the soil makeup and the science of the soil and recognize that you probably don't need any additional fertilizers to improve the growth of your plants. And often you'll over fertilize. If you've got a good, rich soil and you're adding fertilizers, you could be over fertilizing your plants, and that could be making a big difference in how your plants grow. Lily's asking, do you think tomatoes will do better in an 18-inch raised bed versus an 8-inch bed? I just modified my 8-inch bed to 18 inches high. It depends. It depends on what's underneath that raised bed, because tomato roots will easily grow 12 to 15 to 18 inches deep, which is why I think you're asking the question. They can also grow 24 to 36 inches deep if they're given enough time. If the soil underneath your bed is nutrient rich, well draining, not compacted, and the tomato roots can grow into it, then yeah, you can grow tomatoes in an 8-inch bed with no problem. If you're in an area like mine where the soil underneath the beds is nutrient poor and compacted, then growing in an 8-inch bed just means your roots are all going to grow laterally. They're going to be horizontal roots and fill the bed. You can still grow in an 8-inch bed, but the roots are not growing the same way that they would if the soil underneath were rich. And so most of my beds fall into the taller raised bed category, about 16 inches high, because I can grow tomatoes and other plants that have a deeper root. The area of my garden that is primarily my tomato garden area, those beds are 22 inches high to allow extra space for the tomatoes to grow. So yes, generally 18-inch high beds will give you better tomatoes than an 8-inch bed, but it is determined by how good the soil is underneath. So take a look at that, and that could also help influence what plants you might be growing in those beds in particular. Let's see, Octavia says, thanks. Oh, you were talking to Greg Daner. Sorry about that. Talking about shipping. I am glad you guys are talking back and forth. It's always nice. Outlier Gardner, always nice to have you here. Thank you for that. Always thankful for this community. Yeah, the community is great. I'm trying to answer questions, and I'm seeing that there's a lot of questions that have already been answered by others. So this is an outstanding community. So thank you for being here today. That's wonderful. Dave is saying our water table is 3 to 4 feet down in Florida. In Arkansas, our well was dug down to 985 feet. Yes, it can make a big difference on where you live as to where the water table is. And here in the Rocky Mountains, we might go down a couple thousand feet to actually get a good water source. And for that water source to not be drained anytime soon, which is why some of our aquifers are thousands of square miles in size, but they're very, very deep. But some of those are the ones that are being accessed now because the ones that weren't that deep have been drained or are reaching the point that they're really not a good water source anymore, which is kind of sad. Hopefully we'll be able to get to that point. Beyond the Box Garden says, hey, Scott, hey, back at you. Have you ever tried in-ground composting? It's pretty amazing. Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of trench composting in a garden bed because of the fluctuations of nitrogen in particular and how long it takes for those chunky pieces from kitchen scraps to be converted into usable form for the plants. But I do like the idea. I did this at the Galileo School Garden where we dug a massive hole. It was about 3 feet deep, between 2.5 and 3 feet deep. And it was roughly circular with about 20 to 25 feet diameter. And so after we dug that pit, then we filled the pit with leaves and with grass clippings and with twigs. And we essentially turned it into a big in-ground compost pit. It was incredible. Yeah. Saying it's amazing is an understatement. It doesn't heat up like a compost pile that you might heat up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 70 degrees Celsius. It's not that kind of composting. It's a much slower process. And there were a lot more insects and animals involved with the composting process. So terrible soil. We dug this pit, filled it with organic matter, and it was filled with earthworms and with all types of different beetles and centipedes and all those mealy bugs that also work together to break down the organic matter. And the result was incredible soil, incredible compost. So yeah, I have tried it on a pretty large scale, and it is definitely amazing. If you've got a back area of your garden and you're not using, and you've got a lot of organic matter, I would suggest try it. Dig some holes and bury organic matter in it and give it some time. And you're going to be amazed at the results. It really is pretty incredible. So Serena's asking, when is your next mentoring video? I'm planning to do it after the show next week, Serena. So I'll be sending out a message for the members of the Gardner Scott community and give you the link to that. But I'm planning to do that next Monday. So look for it then, and look for that notice for those of you who have become members. Now, the key difference when we talk about the members only live stream, for those of you, if you're already a member or if you're looking to be a member, there's 3 different levels. And so those mentoring live streams are for the training and the mentorship or the collaboration levels on the channel. So I've had that question asked before for the basic support members, and you have access to the Facebook page, but you don't have access to those live stream mentoring live streams that we do. But that will be coming next week. So, and here, let's give a shout out to Jay. This Saturday on the Urban Gardener channel, Jay will be hosting a live show with Katrina from Sow and Tear. So look for that. It's always nice to see Jay on camera. We had her here a few weeks ago, and she does a lot of work with Enoch on the Urban Gardener channel. So tune in at 2 p.m. Eastern time on Saturday on the Urban Gardener channel and see Jay stepping away from her facilitator role and becoming more active. I like that, Jay. Good for you. So Mushroom Snail gifted a Gardener Scout membership. So thank you for that. I appreciate the support of the channel and appreciate that you're being so giving. So it's always nice. Gardeners are just giving people. I think it's I say it all the time, just how wonderful you all are as a community, but just in general, gardeners just tend to be more courteous, more gracious, more understanding, more patient for sure. And that's a big reason why I like being a gardener, and we get together and talk gardening using terms that we all understand, of course. And Beyond the Box Garden says it definitely is a longer term type of composting, definitely good for bad soil like up here in Washington, lots and lots of clay. And so, yeah, talking about the in-ground composting. I'm working with a new gardener, well, not a new gardener, but a gardener. It's a new garden for me to be working in. And that's one of the areas that I'll be doing a lot more of. Here in Colorado, like I mentioned earlier, terrible soil. But the craziness is just a few miles from each other, our soil is dramatically different. So my soil is sandy loam, more sand than clay. And her soil is clay. I haven't had it tested yet. I don't think it's a clay loam. I think it's pretty much just clay. And to be able to build some sections of that garden, we're going to have to incorporate a lot of organic matter. And the idea of the in-ground composting is a nice way to do it. When you've got a big space and you start planning out what you're going to do, makes a big difference. And so it's been 3 years, I think, 3 years ago in my walled garden area that I'll be putting plants in this year, I started doing soil improvement. Now, I didn't do in-ground composting like I was talking about earlier. I was primarily doing mulching. So terrible soil, and on top of that terrible soil, I spread layers of manure and leaves and wood chips. And now after 3 years, down to a depth of about 4 to 6 inches, I've got improved soil. Just over the course of years, organic matter, even as a mulch on top of the soil, is going to make the soil better. The in-ground composting is faster than that, but it's still a slow process to create the better soil. And so if you're looking long-term in your garden, those are some things to think about. You can improve your soil with very little effort by just adding organic matter and time. And that's one of those things that, let Mother Nature improve your soil. You just give it the ingredients and the rest will happen. And that's the thing I like to do, is have patience in a big garden area and just let nature do as much of the work as possible. And then I can come back a few years later and reap the benefits with the plants. And so Shawnee's asking, will you cover crop this new garden site? And so I'm looking to make it more of a perennial garden area. And so now that the soil has been improved after these years, and now that I've got the walls in place, and now that I'm starting to put together what I'm going to put in those beds, it's going to be primarily a sitting area in the middle with perennial plants around the edges. And so I'm not planning to use it as a vegetable garden. And that's a key difference in how I do most of my cover cropping. Is I'll cover crop in my vegetable garden beds to improve the soil and to add that organic matter. And so let's talk about cover cropping real quick. So a cover crop, we've talked about amending and mulching. If you grow a plant that covers the surface of the soil, it can act like a mulch. And that is also called a cover crop. If that cover crop, because it's a crop, it's a bunch of plants that are covering the soil surface, if you then take that material and turn it into the soil as an amendment, you may hear it referred to as green manure, because we would add manure to our soil as an organic amendment. This green plant that was growing on top is now incorporated into the soil like a manure to add biomass, the biological material into the soil to improve the soil as an amendment. So that's why I primarily will plant cover crops in my garden, is to improve the soil. But because the soil has already been improved and I've already started adding compost around the edges inside to prepare the beds to put plants into, I'll be putting plants that are going to be there for a while. I'm going to use a mulch, more like wood chip mulch, that is semi-permanent. And I'm not going to really be thinking in terms of a cover crop. So good question, Shawnee. But in that area, I'm going to be treating it similarly to my pollinator garden area, which is put the plants in, put the wood chip mulch in, and then let the plants get established with no fertilizer and very little extra effort. And by choosing native plants and by choosing perennials that will grow in my area, it makes it easier. I don't have to work as hard to keep those plants alive. And I will do a lot of work. It's funny how we gardeners think, especially gardeners like me. I'll do a lot of work so that I can make it easier in the long term. And it's one of these kind of areas. I've been doing a lot of work on the soil so that I can just put the plants in and then let the plants take care of themselves. I'll do prunings and cuttings and things like that. But I want to relax. I want to sit back. I want to enjoy it at some point. And doing those things like cover cropping and regular work on the plants, I've got other things to keep me busy. So we'll see. And I'm guessing I'll be making some videos about that. So that will be coming. Cat's Tiny Wannabe Homestead, welcome. Good to see you here today. As I age, I love raised bed gardens. So thank you for the support of the channel. And yeah, and so getting back to the whole basic idea, the benefits of raised beds, that's another big benefit. And I've talked about that in videos. I talk about it in my book at length about a good reason for having those solid wooden beds, like the 16 or 18 inches that we were talking about a few minutes ago, is because you can sit on them. And I sit on my beds to do a lot of work the older I get. But then also getting back to the very beginning, we were talking about elevated beds. That's a good reason for having an elevated raised bed, is because you don't have to bend over at all. You can have a garden bed that is right at waist level. And as you age, those are considerations that we all need to consider how we're going to garden. And raised beds can make gardening so much easier as we age. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I completely agree with you. And that's another reason back to Shawnee's point about what I'm going to be doing in this new growing space I have. I don't want to be getting down on my hands and knees and having to deal with those plants. That's why I'm trying to make it easy in the new garden that's going to be in-ground beds and not raised beds. And I plan that way. I suggest you plan that way too. The in-ground beds I have are low maintenance beds, low effort. My raised beds, because I can work around them easier, those are my vegetable garden beds. Those are my high maintenance beds, because the raised bed makes it easier to be able to access all the plants. So completely different types of gardening between in-ground and raised bed, and completely different benefits, particularly as you age and how you decide you're going to be gardening. So be aware of that. And LGG Glove, thank you as well for the support of the channel. Nice to see you here again. This is such a great community. It's always nice to see those of you that come back every week and the support you give, not just me, but everybody else. But yes, thank you so much for that. And I do appreciate it. The trip that I was just on, so yesterday was in New Orleans. And if you've seen any of the news reports of how crazy the security lines are at New Orleans, I can attest. It's crazy. It took me 3 hours to get through security. And I was lucky, because after me, it was taking 4 hours. I spent a lot of time in line thinking about my garden and how I should be home tending to my garden as new plants are popping up, and what the gardening season ahead is going to be. And then, of course, I was thinking, what am I going to talk about in the show tomorrow? and that's when I had that thought from last week. Raised beds, something as simple as raised beds, but can have such a huge impact on how we garden. Definitely need to talk about raised beds. But then I start thinking more about all those other things that the basics of gardening and how we garden. And so I'll be talking more about that in the weeks ahead as well. Getting back to the basics. I like to experiment. I like to talk about some of the new concepts and the new things in gardening, and definitely I will continue that as well. But remembering the basics as we get into our gardening season are really important. It really can make a difference in how easy it is, how successful it is, and of course, how much we enjoy it. I'm all about that. So be aware of that and look for that. And, let me know what you think with ideas and, of course, your questions as we move forward about that as well. Jay says, as a tip, as I age, I make my garden beds more raised and permanent. Yes, absolutely. And those of you that have been following my channel can see that. My newer beds are metal and stone for that same reason, much more permanent. And I'm anticipating, looking ahead to those days when I don't want to have to worry about replacing the pieces of the bed. So I'm making them more durable and more permanent. And it's planning for the years ahead, I think many gardeners lose sight of. They're focused on right now. They're focused on this year. Carry it forward to next year. Think about 3 years down the road and what you're going to be doing. And so this new garden, yeah, I'm already thinking next year. We don't even have anything growing. I put some asparagus in actually a couple weeks ago. And we don't have anything else growing in that garden yet except that asparagus. I'm looking ahead beyond this year with no beds to what next year is going to look like after there are some beds, to the year after that when there's going to be some beds too. And so it's fun. I like looking ahead because it gives us something to work toward. It gives us something to anticipate. And it gives us a lot of work to do to get to that point. And I'm all about getting out in the garden and working, coming up with new ideas. So I want to thank you all for being here today and hopefully cleared up some of those basic ideas that maybe you were unfamiliar with or needed to hear again. And next week, let's get together again. Oh, same time, same channel. Monday is our day, and we'll have another great gardening topic. Some of us, it's going to be hot again. Make sure you're drinking water. Make sure you're wearing a hat. Make sure you're wearing sunscreen. Even though it feels cooler because it's still springtime, you got to protect yourself when you're out in the garden. And above all else, enjoy it. I'll see you next week.